Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Nicole and I've got a whole bunch of things to talk to you about today. Well, really just one book, which is unusual for me. Usually in my weekly reading wrap-ups, I have multiple books to talk to you about, but I've only finished one book this week. Well, that's not true. I finished multiple books this week, but the other books are showing up in other videos later, so I only have one book to talk to you about this week that I recently finished. But I have a whole bunch of audiobooks that I've really enjoyed that finishing this book made me want to talk to you about those books. But first things first, let's start by talking about the book I read and listened to on audiobook. And then I'm going to share with you afterwards a whole bunch of audiobooks that I have listened to mostly this year and have really enjoyed, which I should add is somewhat unusual for me. I'm not a huge audiobook listener. I love the feel of books and having that in hand, and so I do the vast majority of my reading with physical books. I sometimes will alternate back and forth between a physical book and an audiobook if I'm really busy, but I rarely listen to an entire book solely on audiobook. But for my read this week, I listened to the entire thing on audiobook, and that book is Fingersmith by Sarah Waters. I really enjoyed this book, really enjoyed the audiobook especially. So let me tell you about this book, and I'm going to tell you why I enjoyed it as an audiobook, and then I'm going to share some other audiobooks that I would also recommend because I know a lot of people like audiobooks, and it's fun to learn about other ones and the narrators who are good on those ones. So to start out with, let's talk about Fingersmith. This is a work of historical fiction. It was published in 2002. I have read this book before, but it was ages ago, like in high school. Nope, that can't be true because it came out in 2002. I made this mistake in my TBR video as well. So I must have read it in college based on when it was published. And I remember really enjoying this book, but could remember nothing about it. And let me tell you right now, that is a good thing. This is a book that I feel like could be easily spoiled by hearing too much of the plot. So I'm going to give you a synopsis of this book, but I'm going to keep it short and somewhat vague because I do think if you hear too much about this book, it's going to ruin some of the things as you go along, and you do not want them ruined. Somehow I managed to go into this book knowing nothing about it. The back of my book doesn't even say what it's about. It's just a whole bunch of blurbs, and I'm kind of glad that's the case. So let me tell you what little you should know. Fingersmith tells the story of Sue Trender, who is an orphan who has lived a sheltered life with the thieves that are raising her. That's right, thieves. She's being raised in a loving household of thieves. That is the setup of this book. And she's just going about living her best life. They are sheltering her, and she is just watching the trades and the deals and all the things that go on in this scheming family. And then one day, one of their business partners, who's like the rascal and rogue of all rascals and rogue, gentleman, as he goes by, shows up and makes a proposal for Sue. But it is not a proposal for marriage. It is a proposal to be involved with him in one of his greatest heists. And Sue has to decide to join him and really test her own mettle and see if after all this time she can make a name for herself, or if maybe it's going to turn out that she's kind of gone soft. So that is how the story is set up and begins. It's set in Victorian times in England, which is very fascinating as a work of historical fiction, and that part of the book I would say is really well done. Given the setting, this book explores a lot of themes surrounding Victorian life and society, particularly issues amongst class as well as sexism, I would say, and Victorian morals in general. And finally, there is a lot of discussion about poverty in Victorian England and the lack of opportunity that is presented to both the poor and more specifically to women of all classes. I really enjoyed this book. There were two major highs for me in reading this. One I would say had to do with the plot itself. I thought it was a very unique plot and premise and setup, and the plot arc as a whole was really well handled, really intricately laid out, and just very fascinating. It kept me wanting to come back to the book over and over again just to find out what was going to happen next, and it was completely unpredictable. I never saw what was coming until it was basically being sprung upon me in the book, and I enjoyed every last second of that. The other thing that I would say is really well done in this is the narrative voice and perspective. This entire book is told in the first person, and the characters have very strong personalities, a very clear character voice comes across. Now, some of that maybe, again, because I was listening to the audiobook, and in the audiobook, the audio narrator does a very good job of, expressing the different characters' voices that you hear in the book, and most particularly that of our protagonist. If there was any low in this book, I would just say that at times the pacing seemed slightly off, where we have all this great, intricate plotting going on, and then there were just two moments that I could think of where I felt like we were spending just a little too long in sort of a waiting sort of scheme, if you will. And I get that that was supposed to communicate a sense of how long our character was kind of stuck in a particular moment. But I think it just went on for too long, and that if these two different times that I'm thinking of had been just a little bit shorter, or the pacing had just been a little faster through them, that overall it would have worked better for the novel. I did find that there was one point where I did physically sit down to read it where it felt like the book was starting to become too long. And I don't know if that was just the change from audiobook to physical book, but I don't think it was. I think that the pacing was a little off in a couple of sections of the book. But the audiobook did help me get through that. I find audiobooks are good for that in terms of helping even out pacings in books. It is a long, chunky book. It is just under 600 pages. I don't know that I would say that's totally justified. I really feel like this book probably could have come out closer to the 400 page mark, but it was still really good, and I actually gave it 5 stars. And I do want to say that I gave the audiobook 5 stars. If I read this physically, I do have the feeling it would have fallen into the 4-star range just because of the pacing. This is a book that I would recommend to a lot of people. I'm not sure if I would reread it. I'm definitely holding on to it. It's not something that I could see myself rereading on a regular basis, but maybe every 20 years, like I seem to be doing right now. So I could probably read it one more time before I die and enjoy it, because there are some things that happen in the plot that I feel like won't hold up that well to reading year after year. So, yeah, that's something I have to consider, but I would definitely read more by Sarah Waters, particularly Tipping Velvet. I know that's one of her other works that a lot of people tend to like, so I would definitely try that one next. Did I say I gave this 5 stars? I did. I just remembered that. So I would recommend this to a lot of people. I think just the plot itself is something that would really be fascinating to a lot of people. I would recommend this book to anyone who enjoys a good first-person narrated story with a strong character voice and a really fascinating protagonist. I would also encourage anyone who likes historical fiction, and particularly historical fiction set in Victorian times, to give this book a try. I think it fits that time period really well. And the writing style overall, as well as the characters and characterization, really harkened back to Charles Dickens to me. There was something very familiar in the way this book was written. So I do think if you like classics, and particularly Charles Dickens, or maybe even Wilkie Collins, and you're trying to find some more modern books that have a similar feel, I would give this one a try. And from what I recall, Sarah Waters is pretty well known for getting that Victorian writing style down pretty well. And if you're just in general looking for something that is different from a lot of the other books that you're reading, I don't think I've read a book that is like this in a long time slash ever. Now, I will say that I don't tend to read a lot of mystery books, but I do like books that have mysterious elements in them. Like I said, I really enjoyed this audiobook. The edition that I listened to was narrated by Juanita McMahon, and I would highly recommend that audiobook. It was just really good entertainment, and the storyline is clear enough and straightforward enough that I found it was something that I could listen to while going for a walk or doing very simple tasks around the house, and I didn't feel like I was missing things because it just kept my attention regardless of what I was doing. That gets me to other audiobooks that I'd like to share, and these are some of the best audiobooks that I have listened to, most of them this year, like I said earlier, and these are audiobooks, guys, that you have just got to hear. There is something really good about all of them, and I really think that these are audiobooks that if you're trying to get more into audiobooks, they might be audiobooks worth trying. For each one, I'm going to share what the book is, who the author is, as well as the narrator of the version that I listened to, because narrators can vary and can make or break a book. That I have learned. I'm also going to share why I enjoyed these books on audiobook, because I find keeping and paying attention to that helps me identify other books that I might enjoy more, or at least may enjoy at all, on audiobook versus physical book, or in addition to a physical book. So I already mentioned Fingersmith to you. I'm just going to reference my little notebook here. Another book that I really enjoyed on audiobook is Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. I listened to it narrated by Ruby D. That actually came from a recommendation by a viewer, and thank you for that, because you were absolutely right. That was an amazing addition. And I think the thing that is most helpful about listening to Their Eyes Are Watching God as an audiobook is that that book relies heavily on eye dialect, which is when you're reading the text and it is abbreviated and punctuated words to help you like hear the dialect of the person visually. And if I'm honest, I don't think Nora Zeale Hurston is very good at writing eye dialect. If you're struggling with it, an audiobook is a great way to overcome that, because again, it's often relying on your being able to read their accent, and sometimes being able to just hear somebody's accent is much easier to do. Another book that I really enjoyed on audiobook is actually a series of books, and that is the Oz series by Frank Baum. I have pretty much enjoyed any narration of his books. They are very family friendly and they're very adventurous, which gets to adventure stories in general. Anything that's plot driven, I tend to find I enjoy way more on audiobook most of the time over character driven books, because there's something about the like excitement and pacing of an adventure story that really just holds your attention when you're listening to audiobooks. And yeah, the Oz series is a great one, especially because it's one that, you know, you can feel safe and comfortable playing out loud and having anyone listen to. So if you know, want to do it as a whole family, it's a good time. I would also say for memoirs, that's another type of audiobook that I enjoy listening to, and I particularly liked Lovely One by Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. I think one of my favorite things about memoirs is that they're frequently read by the person whose life they're talking about, and that is the case in Lovely One. It is narrated by Ketanji Brown Jackson, and she also includes audio clips of her daughters at times, and she has a lovely reading voice, and it's always just interesting to hear about somebody's life in their own voice. I also really enjoy listening to nonfiction on audiobook. I'm not quite sure why that is. I think because I don't know, I find nonfiction can sometimes be very dry, but when I listen to it on audiobook, it almost just feels like I'm having a conversation with another person, and that they're just talking to me and sharing with me their great, amazing ideas. One of the nonfiction audiobooks that I listened to this year that I really enjoyed was The Overground Railroad by Candacy Taylor. In this case, it was narrated by Lisa Renee Pitts, and I really liked this book as a whole. She's sharing about a whole bunch of different locations and about the Green Book itself, which was basically a travel guide that was used by African Americans up through just before and up through the time of civil rights, where it was not safe for African Americans to travel around for a variety of different reasons, some of which are still the case today. Even though the physical book itself has pictures, I just liked the combination of, in this case, of listening to the audiobook and having her tell me about these places, and then being able to look at the pictures as she's talking to me about them. So I think having those two things are great. It's definitely a book that I would recommend reading in tandem. There's another word for it. I always forget. But basically, immersion reading. That's it. Listening to the audiobook while physically reading it. But you'll basically be listening to the audiobook while looking at the pictures. And going back to the idea of first-person narrators, which is something that I liked in Fingersmith, I think that is always a topic that works really well on audiobook, especially if you have the right narrator. Getting that physical book that is a first-person narrator and has a strong voice, and then combining that with a well done audiobook really like draws you into that character. You really feel like that person is talking to you and sharing some hopefully deep, juicy secrets with you. And one of those books that I can think of is One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. I recently listened to this, and I have to say I really enjoyed that audiobook. I listened to the one that was narrated by Richard Brown. And I think the reason that I enjoyed this particular audiobook is because you have a person who is just sharing, as the title says, one day in their life. And so it was just really fascinating to hear. It's a very short book as well, and so it's a audiobook that you can listen to in just one day, and it's like sitting with someone for one day while you go about doing whatever, or just sit there and listening to them tell you about this really sort of tragic yet fascinating life experience that they have, which is in the prison system of the Gulag. So, sounds like it could be very dark, but it's surprisingly not as horrific as you would think. And I think it's because of the narrator of this story. Um, the book is really well done, and I think putting it on audiobook just brings it that much more to life. I also really enjoyed Julia by Sandra Newman. In fact, I didn't listen to the vast majority of this book on audiobook and thought it was kind of dragging. And I happened to listen to the last third of the book on audiobook, or at least I started the audiobook in the last third of the book and had a completely different reading experience. This is a book that I would highly, highly, highly recommend you try on audiobook versus the physical book. And I think that's because audiobooks can help with the pacing of a book. There are times where I have found a book is kind of going slow for me to read it or has gotten a bit dry, but somehow, again, if you have an engaging enough narrator, it can make that book all the much better. And Louise Brealey is the person I listened to for Julia, and she did a bang up job on that audio narration, really made the book for me, helped me finish it because I don't know if I would have without that audiobook. And then the final audiobook that I am going to mention is a throwback to ages ago, and this would be Raggedy Ann and Andy. And I actually listened to this when my son was a child. He is now in college. I happened to, in searching the internet, come across LibriVox, which is a website that has existed for quite a while that has volunteer voice actors record parts or all of books. And I will include a link below, hopefully to the Raggedy Ann and Andy that I listened to, as well as to LibriVox in general. And I was so happy that I discovered this. We had a book of Raggedy Ann and Andy stories that my son really enjoyed. Then I found the free version of it on LibriVox, and it just became a whole thing. And so for the next 2 or 3 days, we listened to every LibriVox edition of Raggedy Ann and Andy that we could get our hands on, and there were a lot of them. And there is one part that really sticks out in my memory, and it was the collection of them that was narrated by what sounded like basically a younger child, like a younger boy voice actor. And that kid did such an amazing job of reading these books and doing that audio recording that it just brought the story to a whole nother level. We absolutely loved it, and it was just such a memorable time for me, like listening to this book, and seeing my son be able to enjoy it while resting and watching him recover. So hopefully I will be able to find that and leave that below for you. And it was something that even as an adult having to sit there with him and listen to it, it helped pass the time for me as well. So that is it. Even though I had just the one book to talk to you about, I managed to squeeze in a whole bunch of other books. I definitely suggest checking out those audiobooks. You can go and look up and find more about what those different books are about if you don't know about them. But I included a variety of different types of books, classics, nonfiction, that kind of thing, in hopes that you will find something that you yourself will enjoy. Let me know what your favorite audiobook is or was down in the comments below, and I will talk to you next time. Bye! Sue finds herself torn between Sue suddenly finds herself having to decide, okay, let's just try this all over again. Hopefully that's not too much of a spoiler for either book. But yeah, this is, maybe that was. Okay, so I think I just said a spoiler, so I think I'm going to cut that out. But